Hello and welcome to Insight. Today we have with us eminent journalist, member of the Rajya Sabha and Padma Bhushan awardee, Mr. Swapan Dasgupta. Join us today as we discuss what we really mean by the civilizational state, what are its contours, and how would recent controversies be addressed within the civilizational state framework. Welcome, Swapanji. It's really a privilege to have you with us on Insight today. Let me begin by asking you, we talk a lot about the civilizational state. What does it really mean? What, in your opinion, does it really entail?
Well, you see, I think India is a very unique case. The normal yardsticks by which people measure a nation state, commonality of either faith or language or something like that, very ethnicity and things like that, somehow don't work. That doesn't work in the case of India. The usual Treaty of Westphalia model is not applicable in the case of India. What makes India, on the other hand, is what binds it together is a form of culture. Now, culture, which itself, it's very difficult sometimes to define. Why is it that one part of India feels attracted to another part of India? But it's overall, therefore, the conventional definition which we would prefer is that it is not a nation state in that sense, but it's a civilizational state. And it's bound by a sense of oneness. It's bound by emotional bonding, which is there. It's very difficult, again, sometimes to define it. Some people have called it sacred geography, some people have called it something else. But whatever it is, I think the word civilizational state does epitomize this thing, whereby a lot of people, it used to be said India as much of a nation as the equator. So the reason why people didn't quite get the hang of it is because they never thought that culture, own civilization and commonalities of that could actually be the basis on which a nation state can be built. India has demonstrated that.
So as it becomes more popular where people are talking about the civilizational state and, what changes in society as, one comes to accept this terminology?
Nothing changes in society. Society evolves. And in India, what has happened is the mere fact that there's been a great degree of communication, etc. There's been a unifying feature of the markets. I think all of these have helped it to make it that there is a sense in which, on top of the civilizational state, some other forms of political unity is also coming into being. So that's a more recent phenomena. And a lot of people have attached too much importance to that. But I think what is very important is that this is important in the context of the 20th and 21st centuries in terms of the purposefulness and the way you can act as a country. And that's what I'm saying. Therefore, on top of the civilizational state, you have a certain measure of political unity.
So America is called a civilizational state. China has been called a civilizational state. India has been called a civilizational state. Are there any very starking differences between the way we see these countries and we see India?
We of course see them. China has a certain measure of thing. There is a certain Han uniformity which is there in China, and they've tried to make a uniformity in terms of their language, which in India we don't try. We have different expressions of linguistic expressions. America also has this thing about the melting pot, whereby a certain measure of uniformity is imposed, and it's not sort of forcibly imposed, but it sort of works in that way. India, we don't. We actually celebrate this diversity, and that our civilizational is like a mosaic, and therefore there are different parts of it which complement each other. And now you will say, how does it complement each other? Now that's again a very difficult one to say, how does it complement each other? But there is a feeling. There are various features whereby it's seen as one entity. And this has always been the case. India has lacked political unity. India never had a single state. But there was a sense of Bharatvarsh, a sense of India, which always existed. And people in their minds, in their imagination, always thought of that as an India. And that's been there for a very, very long time.
So as this term sort of becomes more popular, not just in India, but even abroad when they look at India, do you think that impacts foreign policy? It impacts the way the world looks at India and the way India looks at the world?
Well, I don't think it's become totally popular. I think there is a lot of people who still resist the idea that India is a civilizational state. They try to measure India in terms of the other yardsticks and often find it wanting. And therefore, a lot of the academic discussions on India sometimes concentrate disproportionately on the vociferous tendencies that may or may not exist in this country. But I think in terms of how India is shaping up, India firstly is not a power which has existed on the basis of conquest. This is one of the unique features of India. There's never been any examples of Indian conquest. Indian influence, yes, not conquest. India had a certain influence in Southeast Asia. You can, in parts of Bali, Indonesia, Cambodia, present-day Cambodia, etc. Even Sri Lanka, there's been a lot of Indian influence there. But you can't say that India physically made that a colony. That's, I think, a very, very important. Secondly, I think the reach of India in terms of its civilizational, in terms of its attractiveness, was not because there was a single center. I think that would be a mistake. In China, there's always been the center of the Middle Kingdom. In India, there's never been this idea of a center. So each of these complementary parts have a certain degree of autonomy and a basis on which they are equal in that sense. There's no sort of hierarchy in these constituent parts of it. So that's an important part. Now, in terms of foreign policy, it's been some time. It's been a while before India has made considerable gains. Earlier, I think we often, even under Nehru and Krishna Menon, India saw itself as a quality in world affairs. But the problem was that preachiness was not accompanied by a measure of economic strength. So there was a sense in which India had to go with a begging bowl, and there was always this caricature of India leading a ship-to-mouth existence and having to beg for sustenance, etc. Now that phase is well and truly over. Now I think there is an understanding in the world that India may not be the topmost of the developing countries, but it certainly has a unique place in it. That it doesn't really need to rely on others for its own sustenance. Now, this has meant that a lot of the Asian countries, a lot of the Asian countries, some African countries have actually looked upon India in terms of not merely as a leader in terms of its ability to be head of NAM or G20 or something like that, but more in terms of how India is an alternative center of economic well-being. So I think both have come in. So the civilizational state has meshed in with the idea of India as a growing economic power. And I think it's complementary. And I think in India, we often emphasize the soft power approach far greater than we approach the hard power. So in that sense, that soft power approach has also worked in terms of our ability to make dent in the IT sector, in terms of our brain power, which we've actually too generously exported to the world without necessarily sometimes looking at ourselves. But that's it. That's been the sort of Indian footprint all over the world, which is there.
Coming back to India, a civilizational state framework, if you look at recent controversies like the hijab controversy, some see it as a challenge to freedom and some see it just as a rules and regulations sort of issue. In a civilizational framework, how would this be addressed? Would it be addressed any differently?
Well, the point about when you say it's a civilizational state, how does it work with the Constitution? That's always been going to be a question, because the Constitution is based on certain rules, certain understanding on how society is to be ordered. Now, in the case of something like the hijab controversy, for example, you could say, well, it's not really offensive in any way. That doesn't affect people outside the Islamic world, it's Islamic society. And if it affects a part of Islamic society, therefore it should be left alone. And therefore, the normal rules of gender equity, which should be there in a modern state, should not necessarily, we needn't apply that. And if we take the idea of a civilizational state to mean diversity and the admixture of various phases of development, we can just take it and then say, well, this is part of our world, you can do as you wish. There's a certain cultural anarchy which can prevail in this country, which is not necessarily the case. Here we are talking about certain common consensual values. When those consensual values are offended in some way, whether it happens under the framework of a Hindu thing or a Muslim thing or any other religion-wise, it has to be set right. So this civilizational state does not necessarily exclude the humanitarian basis, the humanness of any civilization. So in the case of the hijab controversy, it is seen as an affront to the women concerned. It offends their self-respect, their dignity, and their status in the public eye. So that way, that is why there's been a movement against it. Now, obviously, it's not gone unchallenged. There have been others who've taken recourse and said, look, it's based on our scriptures, etc., or faith. Whether that is the case or not, we don't know. I mean, I'm not getting into that controversy as yet. But all I can say is that a civilizational state does not necessarily mean that the civilization is frozen in antiquity, that the civilization is not modern.
So, if the constitution often seems to become the battleground when we talk about a civilizational state. So, if that is the case, do you think that there would be changes, or that when the Uniform Civil Code is brought in, it would have been easier if we understood the concept of the civilizational state, or if this country was a civilizational state?
Well, the Uniform Civil Code is an aspiration. It's an aspiration which is written in the Constitution, which is there, but we are some way from actually coming anywhere close to it. Partly because we haven't got a draft. For a common code to actually take shape, and it affects every single individual in India, you need a draft. You need for the people to know what is there necessarily, what are the modifications, what are the changes which are going to come. That hasn't yet happened. But all I can say at this stage is that yes, it is desirable. Two, till the time it is applied, until the time it is made into part of Indian law, we should have a system whereby all the other civil codes which exist are based on certain common notions of humanity. That it respects the notion of gender equity, it has the sort of equality, and the idea that non-discrimination against on the basis of gender or some other criteria. Those should be, that's the interim stage, leading to the point where you can have a common civil code based on your ability to extrapolate all the good features of the different cultures and traditions which are there. But as I said, this is a very difficult task, and we can do it only after there is a draft which can be actually discussed.
So I know you've said that the best parts of all our diversity need to be brought in. But considering this country is uniquely ethnically diverse, theologically diverse, how do we bring it all together under a civilizational state?
Well, you're right in saying it's ethnically diverse. I mean, let's take the case not merely of these. Take the case of customary law, which is one of the biggest problems which you're going to face. Customary laws, particularly in northeastern India. And in that, how do you weave that in? Where do you give the space for local cultures and traditions? Now that's a big challenge. I would say that why should local traditions and cultures be actually suppressed and made your uniformity? One size does not necessarily fit all. So you can have a common civil code, but where do you accommodate differences? Now it's an intellectual challenge. It's a legal challenge. That's why I'm saying it's not something which should be taken very casually. That draft is very, very important. We need a working paper first so that people can say, no, this is unacceptable, this is acceptable, and this is where the modifications take place. I don't think human ingenuity is lacking, so that customary law can be brought. And there's the tradition of common law which exists in the United Kingdom, which is where customary law actually fits in various ways in that. How do you take modern statutes and fit it into customary law?
Quite right.
It's a challenge. It's a challenge idea.
I think that's a point very well made, because I think that's one of our largest challenges, having such large parts of our community being tribal, with, ancient practices that we don't quite understand, nor do I often say, do we have the tools in terms of academic tools to understand them as yet as well.
We understand it on their own terms, but we do not understand it when it comes to how it engages with the modern world.
Absolutely. One of the problems that I always face while studying these areas is the fact that even the academic tools that we use are outsider tools. So anthropology or sociology, these were all colonial arms, So right from the basics, I think this is truly an intellectual challenge. But having said that, we also have been talking a lot about the freedom of temples from state control. Again, it's been in the news, it's been controversial. What are your views on that?
Well, I think it's not that complicated an issue. In India, most religious shrines are controlled by their own people. Whether it's the SGPC in terms of the Gurdwara, which was enacted in the 1920s, you have certain self-regulating bodies in terms of the mosques, etc., which is there. But when it comes to temples, it's some temples which have self-regulation, but the larger ones are controlled by the state control bodies. Now, initially, the purpose behind it might have been to actually weed out some of the corrupt practices, the other distortions which might have existed. But I think we've gone beyond that now. And I think there is a demand in society now that that the Hindus too must be able to regulate their own religious practices and their religious institutions. And when that is not happening, and there's a sense in which the majority community actually feels discriminated against. And that is it's a very dangerous thing to happen. If a majority community feels that somehow it's being left out of the thing, you can have a very strong backlash, which is certainly not desirable. So I think ultimately now that the demand for the community regulation of the temples has taken up, I think it's time that where the state can be the facilitator. It's like the privatization. In the sense, what we're talking about is privatization. And how do you facilitate that privatization in a smooth way, in an orderly way, in a way where the new institutions, where the new controlling authorities are also accountable?
Correct.
So this is the thing. It's more a management challenge rather than anything else.
But then on the other side, you also have the Waqf board controversy.
Yeah. Waqf board. Waqf boards. I think they're right in some sense. Waqf boards themselves are extremely badly managed. I mean, when I say badly managed, I could probably say that some of them are extremely corrupt also in their way. And these are accusations which have been made by the community itself, community leaders. So the Waqf board too needs to be. These institutions cannot be left, we said, in the sense that they are untouchable, in the sense that we can't absolutely interfere at all with what is going on. Yes, there is a need for certain, if there are practices which are undesirable, I think they need to be thinking. I think the Waqf boards too need a certain degree of reform, accountability. Who are they catering to? Are they catering to the community, or are they catering to a small group of people who are the management trustees? That's
one of the allegations that
which is
power was controlled by a small bunch of
yeah, exactly, and that's there. So the entire the idea behind the Waqf boards has been defeated.
Quite right, quite right. But having said that, why do you think all of these controversies that we've seen and these debates that have come up and people have become more aware, why is it now that suddenly people have become more aware of all these issues, or has it been gradually happening?
No, I think there has been a fundamental change in the way in India we are looking at the polity. There was a time when it was always believed that the only thing which really mattered was the economy. That what really mattered was that the country should take care of the living standards of people, the GDP, etc., etc., and that's your primary significant focus, with some social ills being attended to. The importance of religion and religious institutions was consciously undermined. It was always an important factor, but it was never formally recognized in the structures of power. So it existed as an informal grey area. Today what has happened is that those grey areas have now become part of the larger thing, and people are thinking, no, these are very important. They are part of your larger institutions of life. Your social existence is based on these things. And that is the reason why the internal workings of all these have now started being examined with a more critical eye than was hitherto the case. I think what we are seeing is that the legitimacy of religion has been acknowledged in India. Well, it was always there. Informally, we always knew ourselves to be a deeply religious country. But there was a mismatch between what was there and how the state and how the polity viewed it. We sort of thought of, no, these are private practices, puja room mein jaake, you exist in some tiny corner. That's not the way it works. I mean, maybe it works in some cases, but and there was also a spurious belief that in time religion would become less and less important in the lives of people as modernity. There was seen as a conflict between modernity and religion. So modernity increases its hold and religion retreats. That was the sort of a one-to-one.
Correct, but that was possibly, I don't know if you'd agree, true of, let's say, the European world or the Western world. Was that true?
Well, that was certainly a belief in India among the elites as far as the 1980s, 90s, right from independence, that was a sort of elite aspiration that we will become something in the nature of a mini Europe in terms of our values, if not anything else. In fact, progress was assessed in terms of how much closer you've arrived to America or to Europe. Correct. I don't think those assumptions are true any longer.
Yes, I do think, with sort of public awareness and, it seems like people are reading a lot more. I don't know if it's social media. I don't know if it's general awareness that India seems to have come into its own.
Well, it's a combination of social awareness, but I think economic progress has got a lot to do with it. When you develop a greater degree of self-confidence in yourself, you're able to stand up to people and say, look, I don't need your charity. So you don't become victims of condescension. So you see yourself as people who are successful and who have abilities in our own right. And I think that's the change which has happened. This sort of self-deprecation really took place at a time when India had been drained of its wealth by the colonial things. It didn't happen prior to that. At a time when India was self-confident, but then conquests and drain of wealth. These two have things: loss of political sovereignty, loss of economic sovereignty. Both of them, when they combined, and that was, I think, quite devastating for India. But the fact that for thousands of years we still managed to retain some measure of our self. We preserved an India which had been under assault. And today when we're talking about a civilisational state, you must realize that this civilisational state has also withstood about 1,000 years of assault. So it may not, there may be areas of it which are slightly battered, but it's there. The fundamentals are intact.
Quite right. So let me come to my final question now. There's also been a lot of discussion around the EWS, the economically weaker sections. This has now been largely accepted. Do you think this debate now trumps the kind of caste-based reservations and the idea that we had of that sort of discrimination?
Well, affirmative action is always a problematic issue. It's you know, who are you benefiting? Now in India, caste, at one level we are talking about a casteless society, but on another level, constitutionally we've accepted the caste as a category. And today we are, you know, 1941 was the last caste census. Today we are again back to it. We are again resuming. So there has been, you know, the politicization and the empowerment of certain castes has become a major factor. Castes which were not on the radar, as it were, on the social radar, have suddenly become there. They're important politically, they're important in other ways. Now, the economically weaker section is an attempt within that to find a way out for those who just got left out and who felt shortchanged by the entire process. So it's a way of trying to coexist two different principles altogether. One is based on caste, in other words, your birth, and the other is not based on birth but your circumstances. So you're trying to mesh two very, very different systems. Per se, I don't see anything wrong with it, but I don't think caste is likely to go away. I think we've revived caste in a big way. What we can hope for is that casteism goes away, and maybe caste exists as a social category, but I may be being too wildly optimistic on that front, because I think this is a problem. This is going to be a serious problem in terms of our future development if caste becomes more than just a social category.
You just said that we've sort of revived it. We've revived caste in a big way.
We've, caste was again thought to be something which will go away gradually, erode. It would be there only an election season. There's one form of social organization which exists. Now it's far more. Firstly, there was the reservation of the scheduled castes and tribes. There was a schedule which was there. Then it was extended to the backward castes. Again, there's a tussle about who can become backward and who is not. So everybody wants a share of the reservation pie. And in that context, you find the EWS thing coming in. They too want a share of it. Now, therefore, the idea that to get a share, caste is being revived in a big way. Because it's seen as the category, it's seen as the unit in which a certain privilege can be got.
So you don't see a social shift happening?
Alas, I don't see a social. I think caste is going to remain, but I hope the influence is not malevolent.
Well, on that note, Swapanji, thank you so much for your time, and it's been wonderful discussing with you. It's been like a snapshot of everything that's happened across this year, and I hope to have you on Insight again. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
That was really a comprehensive overview of the hurdles India has had to cross in the past year with Swapan Dasgupta. It was also an account of how a civilizational state would address these hurdles differently. Much has been overcome in the past year with our sheer civilizational strength, and much we aspire to overcome in the coming new year. Thank you for watching.